At the heart of the Christian message is the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, a claim that we can investigate historically. If it happened, it's the most important event ever, the turning point of history. If we say that it didn't happen, we have to look for alternative explanations of the evidence. For example, perhaps Jesus was just a travelling teacher, and the stories about him rising from the dead were legends that built up over hundreds of years after he died.
Well, in a case like this, we have to look at the evidence. Certainly it wouldn't be a myth that was made up hundreds of years later by Christians, because we have early reports, extremely early reports. For example, what we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, an early Christian creed embedded by Paul in his letter to 1 Corinthians. And scholars date this back to within just a couple of years of the crucifixion itself. So there's no way that this is a legend that developed over time.
Again, the idea that the resurrection of Jesus, it was magicked up hundreds of years after the event, was popularised around 200 years ago. But the evidence just doesn't stack up for that. We look at something like a passage like 1 Corinthians 15, which was written in around 51, 52 AD, and that specifically asserts that Jesus Christ was risen from the dead and that 500 people witnessed that fact of his resurrected body. They saw it. Not just one person, 500 people. So already within a decade or two of the event, within 2 decades of the event, we have a written account of this claim. So the idea that this was dreamed up hundreds of years afterwards just simply doesn't stack up.
The first and best evidence we have for the resurrection is the body of writings we call the letters of St. Paul. He no doubt wrote other letters than the ones we've got because he refers to them, but the letters we've got are clear enough. And in those letters, and specifically in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says, "Here is the message which when I came to you, I preached from the beginning, and I passed it on to you, but actually it wasn't just me. Everybody in this early Christian movement preaches this same message." And there was a bit of controversy in Corinth. People weren't quite sure that necessarily Paul was the best apostle. There were other people out there, Apollos and Cephas and so on. But Paul says, look, you know perfectly well, whether it was me or whether it was them, this is how the story goes. Paul is writing that letter about 20 to 25 years after Jesus' crucifixion, but he is quoting traditions which go back clearly much longer than that and are universal, and he appeals to them as being universal across the early Christian movement. And at the heart it goes like this: the Messiah died for our sins according to the Scriptures, he was buried, he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and he was seen by Peter, by the 12, by more than 500 at once, most of whom are still alive. The fact that Paul says that at that point indicates you can go and talk to them if you want. They were there. And then last of all, he says, he appeared to me. And I came in rather late in the sequence. It shouldn't have been in that sequence, but I somehow crept in at the last minute. So Paul is there quite clear about something that has happened in closely living memory, for which there are plenty of eyewitnesses around, and that this is the absolute rock bottom basis of this whole thing we call Christianity.
The problem with thinking that the resurrection accounts could have been tacked on to the Christian message at a much later date, I mean even decades later, but especially if someone says, what about 100 years later? The problem with this is that we have texts from much earlier than that period. For example, 1 Corinthians 15 is the longest continuous treatment of the resurrection. It's 58 verses. But if you talk about material that Paul presents, the skeptical community is pretty sympathetic to the view. In fact, I think I'd just call it a consensus position among skeptics even, that the material Paul gets in 1 Corinthians 15, where he gives the list of appearances to 3 individuals, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and then he puts his own name on the end of the list, and then 3 groups, the 12, a group called all the apostles, and 500 brethren. I assume that means 500 men, so there could be a lot larger group. That list of Paul's appearances, critics actually date it back to between 30 and 35 AD. Whatever the year was Jesus was crucified. In fact, James D.G. Dunn of Durham University says that we can now date the creedal formulation of this material to 6 months after the cross. So there's no way that the material on the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus waits even decades to be given. It doesn't even wait a decade to be given. It comes right out of the gate immediately.
Rather, what the modern skeptic says is that the resurrection of Jesus is a legend. It's the result of myth and legend that has accrued over the decades and over the years and gradually built up and so overlayered the historical person Jesus of Nazareth that we can no longer recover who Jesus was, what he said, and what really happened to him. This counter-explanation of the resurrection of Jesus has really taken a hit during the 20th century, because what scholars have come to discover is that the Gospels are based upon prior traditions that go right back to within a few years of Jesus' death. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul hands on a tradition to his converts in Corinth, which scholars today date to within the first 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And in this tradition, Paul lists not only the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus, but also the eyewitnesses to his resurrection appearances after his death. And so this makes it very, very difficult to dismiss this as the later product of legend and mythology. It simply comes too early. The window of opportunity has been closed.
But actually the gospel stories as well, in Matthew 28, in Mark 16, in Luke 24, and John 20 and 21, and in Acts 1 as well, they have a very interesting flavour to them, because they have not been written up and worked over theologically. They aren't full of allusions and echoes to the scriptures, as you might expect, granted that the early Christians believed that this has happened in accordance with the scriptures. They sound just as though they are the sort of breathless, yes, eyewitness testimony of people who have had this experience of having seen Jesus very, very recently and are still amazed and excited about it. So it looks to me that though the rest of the Gospels have been, as it were, worked over and thought through and sifted out, the Gospel stories of the resurrection really look much more like very, very early eyewitness accounts, which the Church has not edited, cleaned up, sorted out that much, because this is how it was told, and this is how we want to go on telling it.
The accounts of Jesus rising from the dead weren't legends that were added hundreds of years later. They go back to his first followers and to within a few years after he died. There just wasn't time for legends to build up. We have to look for another explanation. It's often said that in the ancient world there were many myths about dying and rising gods. Next time, we'll look at the claim that Christianity borrowed from these pagan myths.